Welcome back, everybody, to 31 1980s horror movies for Halloween, where I'm counting down my favorite horror movies from the 1980s. Yeah, we made it to number 1, people. I want to thank everybody for sticking with me until this point. I hope you enjoyed this series. And like I said in the last video, this is going to be kind of anticlimactic because it's going to be so predictable. But I have to be honest here, so I do apologize if this does seem anticlimactic, but if it's not obvious, my number 1 favorite 1980s horror movie is Maniac. I know everybody saw this coming. I mean, look at my YouTube name, The Maniac. I've made it very clear that I'm a huge fan of this movie. So yeah, Maniac is my favorite 80s horror movie. It's one of my favorite serial killer movies. It's one of my favorite horror movies. If you remember from last year, I had a two-way tie. When I counted down my favorite 70s horror movie, I had a two-way tie between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Jaws. And I said those two were my favorite horror movies of all time. But it's actually a three-way tie. It's a three-way tie between Jaws, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Maniac. People can say that's cheating. People can say I can't have 3 for my number 1 choice. I say, piss off. It doesn't affect anything. I love these movies, and I'm not going to pick between them.
I told you not to go out tonight, didn't I? Every time you go out, this kind of thing happens.
But yeah, Maniac. It's my favorite serial killer movie. Yeah, that's right, I like it more than Silence of the Lambs. And Hannibal Lecter is my favorite character in ever. In movies, film, whatever, movies, TV, whatever. Hannibal Lecter's my all-time favorite character, but Maniac is my favorite serial killer movie. So, yeah, the premise is we have this guy named Frank Zito who kills people and takes women's scalps and then collects them and puts them on mannequins in his house. It's just such a disturbing movie and such a frightening movie, and as I mentioned earlier on in this ranking, it focuses on an idea that terrifies me. That we don't know what people are like when no one else is looking.
Getting very careless. Blood in your hair. What will people say?
The movie takes place in New York City, and you all know I love city-based horror movies. And it's another example of horror being closer to home than we'd like it to be. Frank Zito is one of my favorite horror villains. And I've seen a lot of people talk about Maniac, and they talk about how uncomfortable the movie makes them feel, and they like the movie, but they don't like Frank Zito as a villain, which just means that he does his job. Yeah, he's an effective villain if we don't want to be around him. But that's the reason why he's one of my favorite horror movie villains. Maniac is a serial killer movie, but it is essentially a slasher movie where we are following the slasher. We're hanging out with the killer. We're seeing what goes on in his world. And that's one of the reasons why we're so turned off by him, because we see what he's like. People love Freddy Krueger, people love Jason Voorhees, people love Michael Myers, but the main reason we love them so much is we're only seeing them being the killers that we know and love. But I do believe that if we had to spend time with them, if we saw what they did when they weren't killing people, just being the psychotic nutjobs we know they are, I don't think we would like them as much. Frank Zito is the killer where we see what happens in his world, and for me that makes the movie so much more frightening. Like, there's the one scene where he's stalking this nurse, and it's such a scary scene because we've all had those moments. We've all had those moments where we think someone is following us, and then all these scenarios spin in our brains with, why is this guy following me? What's he doing? This scene in Maniac is like the worst case scenario of what happens when we think someone's following us. We have the infamous shotgun scene. Now, I've said many times that my favorite scene in all of horror is the hallway scene from Texas Chainsaw Massacre when Kirk gets killed. My second favorite scene in all of horror is the shotgun scene from Maniac. It's a great kill. It's a fantastic example of practical effects when Frank Zito jumps on that car and blows Tom Savini's head off. But the reason that scene is so effective, the reason that scene is so scary is the build-up to it. Like, right away, okay, you have this guy played by Tom Savini, and Tom Savini wanted to be the guy in this role because he wanted to make sure he got everything right. He wanted to make sure that he had the right facial expression, so he made that facial expression and then made a cast of his head, and then they blew it off. Anyway, you have this guy played by Tom Savini taking this woman out for a night on the town, and they park their car, they start making out, they're getting frisky, and then we see Frank Zito watching them through the window. I would argue that that's the scariest part of the scene, even scarier than the head getting blown off. Just that somebody's watching you at an intimate moment. It's scary, and it gives you that feeling. It makes you need to take a shower. And the scene builds and builds and builds until we eventually get to that moment when Frank blows Tom's head off. And it's great. But the scene doesn't end there. The blood gets splattered on this woman, and she's screaming and terrified, and then we don't see her get killed, but we see her hair later getting tacked onto a mannequin.
You want to look pretty, don't you? Pretty for me.
Now, I have heard some people say about this movie that it's very surface level, it does not get into the killer's mind, and I'm just gonna flat out tell you bullshit. That is a load of shit. This movie does go into Frank Zito's mind. It just doesn't spell everything out for you. It does it in a visual way. Hell, there's scenes where he's having conversations in his head with himself, and those scenes are terrifying.
That's why they have to be stopped. It is, you're right. You're right. But not like that. Not that way. Please. They'll take you away from me.
But you have plenty of scenes where it gets into his head, just in a subtle way. It's not spelling anything out for you. There's this scene where he has all these childhood toys. He puts one on his head, and he has this little toy that he starts playing with, and he's crying while he's doing this. That says so much about his character. You know, he had a rough childhood, and he's still essentially a child inside, but he's doing all these horrible things. That image says so much about Frank Zito. There's another great scene where he's strangling this prostitute, and for a second it looks like this other woman. And we find out that that other woman was his mother. He had an abusive mother who was a prostitute who used to abuse him. Again, it says a lot about what's going on in his mind without having to tell you. At the beginning of the movie, there's a scene where he's looking at all these scars on his body. Again, telling you so much about this character visually. I can't stand when people say that Maniac is not deep, that it does not get into the killer's mind. It does get into the killer's mind. It just does it through visual storytelling. I could probably do an hour-long review of Maniac, but I won't though, because I think that would get old after a while. But seriously, Maniac is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, one of my all-time favorite movies, my favorite 80s horror movie, and I think people should give it a shot. It is disturbing, it is graphic. It does deal with a serial killer who goes around murdering women. He does murder men too, but that's because they're in the way of his primary target, which is the women. And all I have to say about that is that's true to actual serial killers. A lot of serial killers kill people that they are sexually attracted to. It's a sleazy movie, it's a dirty movie, it's an uncomfortable movie, but that's the point. We're following a serial killer. The Maniac, for me, is one of the greatest serial killers ever made. I could, like I said, I could go on for an hour about Maniac, but I will stop here just because it's Halloween and we have to end this movie so you people can enjoy your Halloween. So, there you have it, people. Those are my 31 favorite horror movies from the 1980s. Going from 31, which was Cujo, and ending rather anticlimactically with Maniac. But all seriousness, thank you all so much for joining me this year for this countdown. I will try to do another countdown next year where I rank my favorite 90s horror movies. Thank you all so much for watching last year. Thank you so much all for watching this year. I'm glad people loved this series. I had a good time doing it. And as always, I want to thank everybody for the continued support on this channel. It really does mean a lot to me. But yeah. Leave a comment down below. Let me know some of your favorite 80s horror movies. You don't have to do 31, that's way too much. But if you want to do your top 10, your top 5, or even your top 3 or 1, go for it. You know, I want you to have at it in the comment section. But yeah, happy Halloween to everybody. I hope you all have a fun Halloween. I hope you all have a safe Halloween. Just go out and enjoy yourself. You know, Halloween is the time for us horror fans, and we deserve to have a good time. So, thank you all for joining me for this series, and until next time, this is the Maniac, here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.
Oh!